Wind up the clockwork, men, clear the desert sand out of your goggles and form a summoning circle as it's time to take a look at a real-time strategy game from 2006. Hi, I'm Caliban, and I've spent the last week playing Rise of Legends, and I'd like to tell you all about it. Rise of Legends was the follow-up to 2003's Rise of Nations, created by Big Huge Games and published by Microsoft. It would be Big Huge's final proper RTS release due to the fact it seriously underperformed in the sales department. 2006 was a difficult time to get noticed. You had to compete with Empire at War, Rise and Fall, and Company of Heroes amongst others, plus expansions for Empire Earth 2, Age of Empires 3 and Dawn of War. On top of this, consoles were upping their game with the release of the Xbox 360 a few months before, and World of Warcraft was keeping the best part of 6 million PC players busy. Suffice to say, as a gamer in 2006, you had your attention pulled in a lot of directions. Rise of Legends would be the last game in this series, as Big Huge Games had trouble finding their footing over the few years that followed. They managed to stay afloat by releasing the turn-based Catan and an expansion pack for Age of Empires 3 before being acquired by THQ in 2008. Unfortunately, THQ started to struggle shortly after, but Big Huge managed to avoid the chop once again via an acquisition by 38 Studios just before THQ imploded. Under 38, they released an RPG called Kingdoms of Amalur, which on the surface did pretty well, selling 1.3 million copies. Unfortunately, it needed to sell 2 million to turn a profit, and 38 Studios laid off everyone both at Big Huge and their own outfit before going under. I'm not sure exactly what production decisions 38 were making along the way, but it seems to me that they were setting themselves up for failure if earning $50 million in game sales barely breaks even, especially in 2012. What's interesting is that a Google search reveals Big Huge Games is still in action today. It seems that 38 Studios must have owed a lot of tax when they filed for bankruptcy, as the state of Rhode Island actually took some of their assets and auctioned them off in 2013. Who was at this auction? Brian Reynolds, the original creator of Big Huge Games. He bought his own trademark back, and Big Huge were reborn, this time as a mobile developer. They released a strategy game called Dominations that can only be described as a smash hit. By April 2017, it had over 30 million downloads and $100 million in revenue, and it's still active to this day. I've not played it myself, I'm in my 40s, and as such I prefer my games on a desktop, but I'm still glad they found success, as I've always been a big fan of Brian's philosophies on gaming. So they might be focused on small, tiny games today, but let's have a look at their last Big Huge RTS. Rise of Legends is set on the world of Ao, a fantastical place where technology and magic coexist. Ao's main continent is divided into 3 regions, each one occupied by the game's factions, the Vinci, the Alin and the Kuatl. Unlike its predecessor, the game takes place within a single point of time, and the technological state of the world is not split into multiple ages that a player can advance through. Although many of the mechanics are greatly influenced by Rise of Nations, it's very difficult to compare it to any other real-time strategy titles of this era, as it fits together rather differently. The game's 3 factions are very distinct. The Vinci are a steampunk civilization, their buildings and vehicles all have plenty of gears and whirly things, and they field an army that contains things like clockwork robots, airships and mechanical spiders. The Alin are a magical sort, ripe with mystics and populated with golems, dragons and flying manta cavalry. Kuatl round off the pack with an ancient religion meets alien race kind of vibe. It's reminiscent of what would have happened if the Stargate villains had been based off the Incan gods instead of the Egyptian ones. They live in temples and throw hordes of force-shielded mechanical snakes and laser-firing eagle gliders at you. I've seen some criticisms about the subject matter of Rise of Legends, as on the surface it might seem like an odd direction when you consider what was featured in Rise of Nations, but really, I think it actually makes a reasonable amount of sense. So you're making a sequel to Rise of Nations, what do you do? You've already made a game that started off in ancient times and ended up in a modern day, and it's a multi-era epic that features a worldly conquest single-player mode. You can't make a similar game that provides the next chapter in the campaign story, as there isn't one to continue, nor can you really try and span an even greater period of time. I don't think anyone wants to start off in the Devonian period with limbs as your first researchable upgrade. It's also probably not suitable to continue the timeline. The nature of conflict has changed. It's all proxy wars, special military operations and insurgencies since the last big one. And if Einstein is to be believed, a 4th World War would be fought with sticks and stones anyway. Perhaps they were saving that idea for a prequel. The games are also just 3 years apart, which is far too short a time to just remake the same sort of game but using newer technology. Also, the game was excellent and everything worked really well, so you don't need to try the whole "we know what we did wrong and this one will be better" sort of release. This limits your options for a sequel, and I think making a game in a steampunk meets fantasy world is probably not as crazy as it sounds. Big Huge Games had already explored the history of our people, so why not explore something a little more fantastical? The game is pretty deep with a lot of features and interactions, so I don't think I'm going to be able to manage to cover the whole of it, especially with the differences between the factions. However, let's take a look at how the basics might unfold in a standard skirmish match for the Vinci. You start off with a city, a mine, a prototype lab and a few units. You've got 2 different resources to worry about, timonium and wealth. You've also got 2 different advancement currencies, research points and prototype points, of which you start with 1 of each. Timonium and wealth are generally used for creating new buildings, improving your cities, unlocking new things and making units. Timonium is gained by mining, while wealth is normally earned by trading. Research points are used for game-wide upgrades in one of 4 categories: military, economy, industrial and nation. There are 4 upgrade levels possible in each of these categories, with each one along the line becoming increasingly more expensive. Prototype points are a bit different, as they generally have more specific effects and often provide both a benefit and a one-time prototype of a special unit. Your city is just that. It doesn't train citizens, as although they exist in theory, they don't partake in the battle. To create a building, you just choose it from the menu, plonk it down in an area that you control and it will self-construct over time. You'll still need miners, but these are produced at a mine and exist solely for that purpose. Like Rise of Nations, it features a resource cap and a population cap, so your maximum potential income and army size starts off very small and relies on increasing your infrastructure. This can be done by expanding your city. Your capital starts off with just a central hub, but you can add on extra districts by building them on the edges. These extra districts provide a variety of benefits, but primarily they increase your caps. Creating an extra merchant district allows you to build more caravans for trading and ups your resource limits. Military districts increase your population cap, and industrial districts decrease production times and provide additional prototype points. Once you've built 3 districts of any type, you can then build a palace district, which increases the bonuses of all the existing districts and turns it into a large city. If you've created enough additional districts, you can then add on a second palace district to upgrade to a huge city, getting more bonuses. The large and huge cities are of particular importance, as some upgrades require you to have one before you can make that purchase. There is a limitation here. With each additional district you create for one particular city, the next one becomes more expensive. This puts the onus on you to seek out new cities and add them to your nation, allowing you to add on extra districts at a far reduced cost. At the start of a multiplayer game, and most single-player missions too, the map is littered with neutral buildings. Some of these are unaligned cities that you can capture, some are special structures that provide additional benefits, and others are more basic things like mines or mercenary barracks. These neutral buildings serve 2 purposes. Firstly, they are something to contest, but secondly, they provide trading destinations for your caravans. Very important in the early game, as you won't have many cities or sites to trade between, and trade is your primary source of wealth. Ideally, you want to take possession of these locations before your opponent does, and there are 2 ways to go about that. Each site comes with its own small defensive force. Your first option is to attack and defeat them, which gives you control over the structure. But violence doesn't solve everything, and the alternative is to pay a rather healthy amount of wealth, resulting in you taking immediate ownership. The benefit here is that the site's defenders are included in the price, so you can immediately add them to your own army. If the structure is a mine, you get the miners too, which can be a very nice boost to your economy. There is a really nice interaction that relates to this method of acquisition. For every trade run that one of your caravans does to this site, the gold purchase price is reduced, and if you do enough of them, then you automatically take control of it and any defenders there without paying a penny. I love this mechanic. Firstly, it's interesting. Secondly, it allows you to make some strategic economic decisions right from the very start of the game, and thirdly, it presents some choice. Do you want it now? Do you need it now? Is it worth the effort, or is it better to focus on another more distant site and then get this one for free later down the line? Choice is good. It gets you more involved in the game and allows more variations in your overall game plan. So we've captured some sites, built some caravans, sorted our economy, and now we want to get an army of lemony snickets all up in this bitch. Time to poke our head out of our clock towers and get producing. We've got 3 primary production structures: the barracks, the steam factory and the aerodrome. I won't tell you what each one of them produces, as it should be self-explanatory. What I will tell you is our unit choices are a little limited. We don't have 100 slightly different types of soldier to pick between, but somewhere in the region of 10 or 12 core units that will do the majority of our fighting. First of all, we've got our foot soldiers, guys with guns or clockwork robots that batter the enemy to death with their big metal fists or spidery legs. To support our line infantry, we've got a tracked artillery piece and a massive tank thing that can crush infantry. From the skies, we've got some light mobile copters, a hot air balloon with cannons, and something that is best described as a steampunk A-10 Thunderbolt. There are upgrades available for all of these units, which do more than just improve the stats. The upgraded infantry can choose between different formations based on what's required: a skirmish formation that spreads them out so they're less vulnerable to being trampled or punched, or a closed immobile formation to improve their firepower, and much later a melee mode where they can switch to swords and go in for the charge. The other units generally get bigger and tougher as you progress through the improvements, and often have their own special timed abilities that you can trigger on demand. On top of these regular forces, you've got some special units, which are either very expensive or come in a limited number. This includes a walker that looks like a squat, fat ATST, and a land leviathan, which is basically a cross between a massive excavator and a scorpion. You've also got a selection of hero units that you can summon, which I'm surprised to say I didn't hate. Normally the whole hero unit thing in RTS never gels with me, and it's something I frequently complain about. But Rise of Legends seems to have found a good balance between power and flavour in a way that many other games struggle with. The heroes have a good amount of health and a reasonable amount of damage output, but they certainly aren't the toughest units on the field. They are, however, the most interesting and rewarding to use, as they each have a selection of activatable abilities that make a decent impact on the battlefield without being overpowered. The abilities are well designed, and as such they're only really effective if your hero is properly supported by a good sized army. Giacomo here can occasionally heal friendly units and give them a temporary power up, and he can cast an AoE stun and knockdown. On his own he's not that effective, but with a decent amount of troops around him to take advantage of his powers he becomes pretty useful. Another thing that helps is these abilities generally have quite a long cooldown, so they don't become too oppressive to play against, and you need to be thoughtful about their usage. Combat itself is reasonably standard RTS fare, although more reminiscent of games like Age of Empires rather than something like Company of Heroes or StarCraft. Some unit types are more particularly suited to fighting other types, but this is really well tooltipped, so it's not hard to get to grips with the interactions. You generally want a good mix with some line troops, some heavy hitters and some supporting players to perform well, but you're not overly punished if you don't have the exact right tools for the job. The individual engagements have quite a bit of scope for micromanaging, as positioning is important, as is making sure the right unit is attacking the right enemy and that you're using your activatables at the right time and in the right place. Generally, I found the battles to be quite fun. Although they do require some management, you are often only fighting a single engagement at a time, so it's not too hard to keep up with what's required. Time to kill on individual units is rather on the long side, so unless you're dramatically outnumbered, then you don't need lightning fast reactions to be able to get involved in these decisions. Your own structures have a large chunk of health, and your cities, defensive and production buildings often have their own firepower. There is also the same territory system as found in Rise of Nations. Your cities and some of the outposts create an area that is very much yours, and one that can be increased in size by various upgrades. You can build defensive structures anywhere within this region, and enemy troops will take attrition damage if they move into your territory without supporting supply units. This means that your opponent can't really accomplish much by sneaking a handful of troops past your army, and as such you don't have to split your attention in too many ways. It's very much a game where one army is designed to fight another, and it does this quite well. It's fun to control, enjoyable to watch, and rewarding when the decisions you make tips the balance in your favour. This doesn't mean that you always have one single huge unified force. The population cap goes pretty high and a huge army takes up a lot of space. Occasionally I'd find it useful to split into 2 detachments and approach from different directions. However, you probably won't find yourself having to worry about 4 or 5 smaller engagements happening all over the map. We've just looked at the Vinci gameplay so far, but from the other sides things do look very different. I'm not going to go into great detail here as this video is starting to drag on already, but there is certainly some asymmetric design at work here. There are of course some basic similarities, but the differences go far deeper than a reskin and a variation in bonuses. Not only does each nation have a totally unique set of units and heroes, but those units aren't a direct one-to-one match with those of the other nations, and each has its own set of characteristics and abilities. They also have both a different set of buildings and different routes in terms of exactly how to acquire research and what sort of things that research unlocks. The Alliance units are split into 3 categories: sand, flame and glass. Their basic infantry carry swords, not muskets, and many of the units are fantastical, mythical or magical creatures. Their production structures are actually quite weak, but you can pay a premium for them and build them in neutral or enemy territory. Each of these 3 production structures also has a corresponding tech structure that provides upgrades, and instead of labs you have major districts for your cities that grant research points. Their nation research has different benefits too, as well as a whole host of other smaller variations, so you find yourself expanding, fighting and generally playing very differently compared to Da Vinci. The same is true for Kyoto, and maybe even more so. As well as a whole other set of units, they swap the trade mechanic with one of subjugation, forgoing the wealth resource entirely and instead using something called energy. This is produced from their own unique city addition called the Reactor District, and is used both as a tech resource and as a power source for the activatable abilities of many of their units. Many of their units can use this energy to activate a temporary shielding or cloaking ability. Powerful additions, but something that you must use sparingly or you won't have enough energy to produce their most powerful war machines. The absolute basics are the same for all 3 factions. You need to mine, you need to expand cities and build production structures to create units, but apart from that everyone is pretty unique, perhaps even more so than the difference between the Terrans, Protoss and Zerg found in StarCraft. The game features a pretty sizable single-player campaign split into 3 sections, and although you follow the story through the eyes of a single protagonist, every chapter is very different as you end up controlling one of the game's 3 factions in each. There is a single coherent storyline that links the events of the game and ties everything together, although the writing is kind of poor and the voice acting is pretty hammy.
I'll catch up with you as soon as I can.
Okay, hurry back.
I was certainly not on the edge of my seat rushing through it at breakneck speed so I could unlock the next part of Giacomo's story, but it is what it is. A narrative to hang a variety of missions against and explain where you're going and why. It's perfectly serviceable for this sort of game, and although basic, it did the job just fine without detracting from the action. Rather than a linear set of missions, each chapter takes place on a world map where you must conquer territories, research upgrades and advance towards your objectives. Some territories consist of a skirmish-like game that you must win to capture, while many consist of scripted missions that exist to both provide variation in gameplay and advance the storyline. Depending on the difficulty level, they range from very easy to somewhat challenging, and I think that the only one I really didn't enjoy featured your hero going sand mad where your army chased after him for 10 minutes. During the campaign, you get to do a fair bit of management of your territories via a system that mirrors the advancement of your in-game cities. Build military districts, and they are harder for your opponents to recapture and provide a boost to your forces. Build merchant districts to gain some currency, and build industrial districts to gain research points to spend between games. Unlike the Skirmish and Multiplayer modes, the unit upgrades in the single-player campaign are achieved using the secondary system rather than researched in-game. It's a pretty simple affair, but it works well and it's not a chore to use. It also has the added benefit that you can focus on different units and heroes on a second playthrough, adding a little more variation and longevity to the game. It's hardly the most surprising, involving or dramatic story campaign I've ever seen in a game. It's a long way from it, but I'm glad it existed and I think it's a good addition. My only real criticism of Rise of Nations was the lack of story and variety in the single player mode, and I think Rise of Legends has found a nice way to plug that gap without distracting you too much from the actual gameplay. As usual, I'm not really going to touch on the multiplayer. Even if I was able to dedicate the time it would take to get really familiar with it, the thing is long dead, so it still wouldn't be possible for me to make a serious attempt. I'm also keenly aware that most people who play RTSs don't give a single solitary crap about versus modes in these games. I'm sure there's better data to back this up somewhere, but I've just had a look at the Company of Heroes 2 Steam achievements, and only 14% of the players have ever engaged in the single automatch game, a figure that drops to 6% when you look at the achievement for playing 10. The skirmish mode against the AI is pretty fun and actually quite challenging on the higher difficulty levels. On normal it's a bit of a cakewalk, and unless it's your first game or two I think most people would win without too much effort. But once you go up to tough, the AI is a hell of a lot more aggressive and effective. The highest two levels, tougher and toughest, are a real challenge, and I'm told the AI does get resource bonuses at these levels, but I've not had the time to verify this independently. All throughout the game there are lots of features to encourage variety in gameplay, and I think this is one of its many strengths. Production costs of units and buildings rises slightly with each additional one that you field, so a varied army is slightly cheaper to produce and as a result more efficient. You can unlock various dominances during skirmish play by being the first player to reach certain production, research or territory levels. These work a little like the crowns in Empire Earth 2 and can change hands several times during gameplay. Holding one gives you access to an additional timed ability. You can't focus on all four, so you must pick a lane. The game actively encourages you to expand along a wide front rather than a narrow path, but it does it in such a way that provides incentives rather than imposing hard limits, and as such it's satisfying to engage with these systems rather than be frustrated by them. Graphically it looks pretty good, not just from a technical point of view, but the art choices are both interesting and really well executed. The three factions are all really distinct with their own particular flavour, and the detail on a lot of the city and production buildings is very high. This is especially true for the Vinci, and they really have got the whole steampunk thing down to a T. If someone had told me to imagine a steampunk city, then what you would find in Rise of Legends is exactly what I would have pictured. Unfortunately, the game is let down a little by the sound design. It's not bad, but it's just not up to the same high standard as everything else. The soundtrack has a couple of solid tracks, including the opening theme, but the majority of it just falls into the category of background music. The really sad thing about all of this is that Rise of Legends just didn't do very well. The scores from the critics were pretty good, being only a few percentage points behind Rise of Nations, but this didn't translate into sales. We know from interviews and press releases that Rise of Nations sold north of 1 million copies, but Rise of Legends only managed a third of those figures. This wasn't an unmitigated disaster that forced the studio into immediate closure, but it was a big, huge disappointment, and the studio would have to scale back its operations and work on a couple of smaller titles over the next year. Personally, I think the game just didn't get a fair try. As we mentioned earlier, competition was very high, and I don't think strategy fans really gave it the chance it deserved. I checked out some old user reviews for Rise of Legends and found the low scoring ones to be pretty frustrating to read. People got very hung up on the subject matter, and it seems that their biggest criticism was the fact it just wasn't Rise of Nations all over again. I said this before and I'll say it again, there was no point remaking Rise of Nations so soon. By the time Legends arrived, it had only been 2 years since the release of the Thrones and Patriots expansion. Rise of Nations was great in 2003, it was still great in 2006, so there was no point making a carbon copy with slightly better graphics. The other common criticism was that the story wasn't that great, an odd complaint considering they wanted Rise of Nations again, a game that didn't have any story whatsoever. But there you go, and this is why I don't put a lot of stock in the opinions of reviews when it comes to strategy gaming. I think Rise of Legends is an excellent game. I never bought it on release as I was one of those millions addicted to World of Warcraft at the time, but I kinda wish I had. I replay all of the games I feature on my channel, even if I was heavily involved in them when they were first published. Partly this is so I can record some footage, but mostly it's so that I can refamiliarise myself with the game and ensure my descriptions are somewhat accurate and provide commentary from a modern perspective. I genuinely gauge how good a game is by my own reactions to it. If playing it felt like work, then it's not a great game. If the time passed easily, then it's probably pretty good, and if I can't put the thing down, then the chances are it's really solid. Rise of Legends falls into that last category. I had already completed the first campaign and played a few skirmishes before I even wrote a single word of this script. As I'm writing this outro now, I've finished the second campaign and moved on to the third, and I'm still going to be playing it well after this is edited and uploaded. It's hard to pick out a single feature or element that really stands out because everything is pretty solid. It's not perfect, sure, but the game continues to impress me, and many of the design decisions that others criticise actually seem pretty smart. The story and the setting, we've already mentioned that, and I totally understand the reasoning. The relatively small number of core units for each faction, again, I don't see a problem here. Each unit has a specific purpose, it's good at some things and worse at others, and the skill is finding the correct combinations of these units and using them in a smart way. More isn't always better, and having a limited set allows each one to be distinct and makes it easier for new players to understand what's going on. I've also seen complaints that the capturing of cities and other sites around the map gets in the way of the RTS action, but honestly I think this is one of the game's strengths rather than its weaknesses. In these sorts of games, rush tactics aren't that effective due to the poor performance of basic troops against structures, the large distances between bases and the attrition mechanic. This has a tendency to make the first 5 or 10 minutes of a game a bit dull, something that was very apparent in Rise and Fall when I tried that a week or two ago. Rise of Legends manages to avoid this, as picking the appropriate neutral sites to capture, purchase or trade is a key part of your game plan and has you making important decisions right from the very first minute. I also like the fact that your opponent's base is not the only objective on the map. It makes the games more varied, exciting and allows a lot of to and fro before a decisive victory is achieved. A small part of me feels that Rise of Legends was actually a little too far ahead of its time, and the RTS community just wasn't ready to accept the fact that many of its design decisions all added up to a better overall experience. Many of the key concepts that it displays, like asymmetric design, player agency, multiple objectives, and simple to learn but hard to master, are the kind of things that we would probably look for in a game today. But back in the early to mid 2000s, we were still stuck in the build a fortress and what's cool must be fun kind of mindset. Maybe that's a bit too much, I don't know, so please don't hold me to that. I guess I just can't understand why the game never felt the love. If you've never played it before, then I'd certainly recommend it. It's not available digitally at the moment, but I got a pre-owned physical copy for under a £5 and it worked perfectly well on my modern rig straight out of the box. If you do buy a copy, just remember, the fourth disc is not on the main spindle but in a separate envelope tucked behind the manual, something the following reviewers may have missed. I think this might have been the case with my copy, because although the shrink wrap was removed and the box was opened, the glue on the envelope for the fourth disc was still intact. People be stupid. So, Rise of Legends. A seriously underappreciated game that turns out to be a really strong offering and one that should have occupied a far higher place of prominence in people's minds. I wouldn't say it's one of the absolute bests that the genre has to offer, but it certainly stands well above the heaps of more average titles that I've played over the years. It's interesting, distinct, features some great mechanics and visuals, and I found the whole thing thoroughly enjoyable from start to finish. Unfortunately, I doubt we'll see a follow-up, just as I doubt we'll see another Rise of Nations. Microsoft owns both of those properties, and on a surface level they are just too similar to Age of Empires, so they will probably see it as just competing with themselves, not something they would want to do in a niche genre. Before I wrap up, I just want to say a big thanks to those who leave me comments recommending other games to try. I'm not an encyclopedia of game knowledge, nor am I a professional critic or industry insider. There are hundreds of strategy titles out there, and although I'm a big fan of the genre, it would be impossible for me to know about them all, let alone spend any time playing the bulk of them. Your feedback is not just vital for the channel, but it also helps me expand my horizons, and without it I doubt I would have ever taken a look at Rise of Legends. But because of you I did, and I'm thoroughly enjoying playing it, and that can only be a good thing. Hi there! Thanks for joining me as I explored the world of clockwork, aliens and magic that is Rise of Legends. If you enjoyed this video, then click the like button, and if you've got anything to add, then leave me a comment or say hi in the Discord. And as usual, if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you back soon.